2:41 a.m. Minneapolis. From the air, nothing looked wrong. Snow-muted streets traced perfect grids. Traffic signals cycled obediently over empty intersections. Windows stayed dark, sealed tight against the cold. It was the kind of stillness that makes a city feel harmless. But below that calm surface, a shutdown was already underway. There were no sirens to announce it, no emergency lights, only motion. Unmarked vehicles eased into position along utility corridors, loading docks, and municipal access routes most residents had never noticed. Doors opened, closed. Footsteps landed softly, without haste. FBI and ICE operators moved as blended units by design. No single team held the full picture. This wasn't about making arrests, not yet. This was about sealing the environment. Across Minneapolis, the same sequence unfolded at the same minute. North Loop, Cedar Riverside, river-adjacent industrial zones, government-adjacent blocks that hadn't raised suspicion in years. Teams surrounded locations that didn't read as dangerous. Maintenance buildings, public storage facilities, shuttered garages, offices that had cleared inspection after inspection. The objective wasn't people, it was infrastructure. Thermal imaging told the first truth. Linear heat signatures beneath reinforced concrete. Air displacement where schematics showed solid ground. Empty volumes that ran too straight, too uniform to be accidental. Spaces like that don't exist without authorization, without inspections, without signatures. At 2:48, the first entry was made. Beige door, standard city hardware. No breach required. The access credentials were still valid. The air beyond the threshold wasn't damp or stale. It was conditioned, cold, actively filtered. Ventilation pulsed behind the walls, steady, recent. A sloped passage extended downward, wide enough for rolling equipment, illuminated by evenly spaced industrial lighting. Clean, maintained, no trash, no markings of concealment. This wasn't hiding anything. It was built to function. Lane indicators guided movement. Drainage channels followed the edges. Directional symbols were subtle, readable only to those already initiated. By 2:54, teams were fully below ground. The tunnel system didn't feel improvised. It felt engineered. Junctions branched with intent. One route tracked toward a city-owned garage flagged for ongoing renovations. Another curved beneath a redevelopment zone tied to public funding and repeated deadline extensions. Everything below matched the paperwork above. The first hub made the scale undeniable. A logistics space opened wide, quiet now, but clearly active moments earlier. Racks climbed toward the ceiling. Carts stood staged in precise rows, tagged with dates and endpoints. No corporate branding, no identifiers, just quantities, mass. Time slots measured in minutes, not hours. A digital display on the wall continued cycling routes, city arteries feeding into interstate corridors. This wasn't storage, it was command and timing. Documentation began immediately. Images, measurements, serial numbers. This phase wasn't about confiscation. It was about pattern recognition, frequency, flow, how seamlessly this place had operated without disruption. Then a secondary access revealed itself. A vertical ladder climbed from the hub into darkness, terminating directly beneath a municipal office complex adjacent to City Hall. It wasn't concealed, it was integrated, designed for regular use, by people with clearance, with keys, with authority. At 3:02, a separate unit entered the offices above. No alarms triggered, no resistance met them. The system accepted their presence as legitimate. That was when someone finally said it. This was permitted. Behind a door labeled archival storage sat another secured space, another scanner, another soft confirmation tone. Inside, a compact server room hummed evenly. Local machines, redundant power, no signage, no inventory records. No reason anyone outside a closed circle would know it existed. One monitor remained active. It displayed financial flows, not personal accounts, not cash stashes. Municipal allocations, development grants, infrastructure budgets, service contracts, the most forgettable line items in government finance. The total continued to rise. $120 million, not taken, redirected, each transaction approved, each delay justified. every exception logged, clean enough to survive scrutiny, invisible enough to expand. By 3:09, Command had the full picture. This wasn't an isolated cache or a rogue operation. Minneapolis wasn't the endpoint. It was a hub, efficient, trusted, optimized to move money and product without raising alarms, because it followed the rules perfectly. And once that became clear, the question stopped being who inside the city was involved. It became how many other cities had already been wired the same way. At 3:36 a.m., the digital core was removed. The servers weren't rushed out or displayed like trophies. Each unit was sealed, logged, and escorted as if it were volatile material, because it was. This stage wasn't about what had been exposed underground. It was about proving the architecture repeated elsewhere. The cyber operations floor activated before sunrise. Overhead lighting dropped. Displays came online one by one. The room filled with the controlled hum of systems doing exactly what they had been built to do. No one asked for timelines. The structure they were about to dissect had an internal logic. Once identified, it unraveled itself. By 3:58, imaging was complete. At 4:11, verification checks locked in. At 4:19, conversation stopped, not due to failure, but because nothing fought back. No wipe drives, no last-minute encryptions, no digital panic, just neatly arranged directories labeled with civic language. Redevelopment initiatives, mobility programs, public safety integrations. Vendor folders written in procurement syntax designed to survive audits. Every dataset presented a different identity, different branding, different public narratives, but beneath the surface, they were clones. Identical directory hierarchies, matching timestamp rhythms. The same metadata signatures embedded deep. Whoever built this didn't experiment, they duplicated. A visual model began assembling across the main display. Not a street map, but a flow diagram. Nodes appeared at city garages, redevelopment zones, non-profit offices, privately owned parking facilities. Connections followed corridors dictated by zoning plans and traffic studies. Areas where scrutiny naturally thinned, where delays were expected, where inspectors were stretched thin. This system wasn't evading oversight. It was nested inside it. Then the financial layer snapped into focus. Funds moved cleanly, grants cleared, amendments justified, contracts rolled forward. Money entered as public service allocations and exited as operational expenses. No offshore drama, no sloppy shell structures. Just domestic entities with forgettable names and immaculate records. The breakthrough wasn't washing dirty money. It was converting institutional credibility into propulsion. At 4:47, an analyst isolated a repeating approval pattern. The same authority surfaced across unrelated streams, sometimes direct, sometimes delegated. Waivers processed fast, inspections deferred. Temporary exceptions quietly fossilized into permanence. No unexplained deposits, no suspicious calls, no leverage applied. This wasn't corruption in the traditional sense. It was authorship. By 5:12, the underground network finally aligned conceptually. The tunnels weren't criminal shortcuts. They were logistics assets, engineered to exploit municipal blind spots. Utility easements, maintenance cycles, construction phases stretched just long enough to mask activity. Every route corresponded perfectly with paperwork already filed above ground. At 5:28, a second overlay appeared. Regional connections illuminated, rail access points, interstate corridors, transfer sites positioned just beyond routine enforcement focus. Minneapolis wasn't a destination. It was a node, reliable, predictable, optimized. The figure surfaced again, not as a headline, but as an aggregate outcome. $120 million, distributed across years, programs, vendors that delivered exactly what their invoices promised, just not what the city believed it was purchasing. By 5:41, physical evidence closed the loop. More than 4 tons of narcotics, segmented and staged with the same discipline as the finances. Nothing stockpiled randomly, nothing left idle. Product moved because the schedule demanded it. At 5:56, Command reached consensus. This structure couldn't be taken apart incrementally. Any phased response would trigger rerouting. The system had been designed to adapt, isolate damage, and continue operating. The objective shifted, not arrests, amputation. Phase 2 would begin everywhere at once. The objective was surgical removal. Phase 2 would not unfold in stages. Across the operations floor, actions queued silently. Warrants cleared in clusters. Asset freezes aligned. Aviation resources retasked. Border coordination channels lit up. This wasn't escalation, it was convergence. The network had learned to survive a government that moved slowly, one step at a time. What it had never accounted for was simultaneity. Motion everywhere, all at once, with no advanced signal. By the time Minneapolis began to stir, the tunnel system beneath it had shifted status. It was no longer evidence. It was a blueprint. Phase 2 launched without a signal flare. There was no flood of vehicles, no visible spike in enforcement presence, just a subtle realignment across the city and far beyond it. Units already in place repositioned by blocks, not miles. Teams that had appeared inactive moments earlier transitioned seamlessly. This wasn't pursuit, it was coordinated shutdown. At 6:18 a.m., warrant authorizations propagated in waves, not individual locations, entire functional categories. City contractors, transit vendors, redevelopment affiliates, non-profits whose documentation appeared benign, alone, and lethal when aggregated. The intent wasn't immediate seizure, it was observation under pressure. The system reacted instantly. Timetables tightened, departures advanced. Vehicles bypassed scheduled stops and diverted to secondary facilities that had cleared inspections months earlier. Inventory migrated between addresses that looked equally forgettable on paper. Analysts had been waiting for this moment. Paper trails lie, motion doesn't. Interventions followed deviation. In North Minneapolis, a warehouse registered as mechanical services opened into a transfer space still radiating residual heat. Tire impressions hadn't faded. Clipboards sat abandoned mid-process. A dry erase board listed columns of times. Handoffs, not deliveries. No endpoints, no names, only intervals. In St. Paul, a parking structure undergoing engineering assessment concealed a freight lift descending below its documented depth. The chamber below wasn't storage, it was staging. Carts labeled by mass, routes taped directly onto concrete. Everything synchronized to windows measured in minutes. Along the river corridor, a non-profit office evacuated personnel in under 2 minutes once financial holds propagated. The reception area was spotless. The basement was not. Investigators recovered binders sealed in plastic, organized by week, each containing travel documents that didn't correspond to the printed identities. The dates aligned across jurisdictions, destinations repeated. By 7:42, denial was no longer possible. This wasn't a single criminal group exploiting municipal resources. It was a modular architecture. Each node capable of operating alone, yet engineered to interlock. Failure didn't break the system, it redistributed the load. Redundancy wasn't protection, it was design. At 8:03, financial locks engaged on accounts that appeared trivial in isolation and catastrophic when combined. Compliance desks scrambled, calls went unanswered, transfers queued and collapsed. The flow stopped midstream, not because of criminal flags, but because authorization evaporated simultaneously. That was when subsurface access points began to disappear. Underground teams moved to seal corridors flagged in the data. Some entries were crude, others were indistinguishable from legitimate infrastructure. Utility panels, service tunnels, maintenance shafts linked to credentials that had been valid for years, until they weren't. At 8:31, a convoy traveling Interstate 94 deviated from its baseline. Speed adjusted by seconds, insufficient to trigger automated alerts, sufficient to miss a synchronized exchange. That micro-hesitation was enough. The stop occurred where the route subtly diverged from habit. The cargo bore no markings. It didn't need them. The paperwork satisfied every system it encountered. By late morning, discoveries shifted in character. Not shocking, weighty, labels, calendars. Intake records stamped with dates matching across multiple cities. Lists that tracked human movement with the same logic used for freight. In some files, names were absent entirely, only mass. Age ranges, condition codes, readiness status. This wasn't disorder, it was bureaucracy. At 9:17, a downtown-adjacent property listed as temporary administrative overflow went dark. Power cut precisely. Network access severed cleanly. Inside, investigators found a compact command space cleared of personal effects, engineered for rapid abandonment. The only item left behind was a printed timetable. No branding, no signatures, just time slots. At 9:44, the first response came from within the approval hierarchy. No detention, no restraints, just a request for a conversation. There was no detention scene, no restraints clicking shut, just a request for a conversation. The reply came instantly. Steady, polite, prepared. The person on the other end didn't ask what investigators had uncovered. They asked for a number. That was the moment it became clear. The most dangerous element of the operation hadn't been hidden underground. It was the ease with which everyone involved had functioned in full daylight, confident the structure would absorb any pressure applied to it. For years it had. By late morning, activity tapered off, not because momentum had faded, but because there was almost nothing left in motion. By early afternoon, Minneapolis fell into an unfamiliar quiet. Data streams stopped refreshing. Dashboards that had updated every minute for years locked onto outdated timestamps. Schedules that once pulsed with precision went dark. The network didn't implode, it simply lost authorization. Inside the operations center, the display transformed. Red indicators dulled to gray. Connections thinned, then disappeared entirely. What remained wasn't triumph. It was negative space, the outline of a system that had been present for so long its absence felt unnatural. At 13:12, custody orders were carried out. No press, no spectacle, no raised voices. The individual identified as the Central Domestic Coordinator was taken in from a downtown office that still carried the smell of stale coffee and warm electronics. There was no resistance, no protest. When the charges were outlined, the response was clinical. One question followed. How much of it did you shut down? The pause before answering said more than the answer itself. By then, investigators understood this wasn't a traditional ringleader. The role had never been about touching product or counting cash. It was structural, approvals, deferrals, reframing risk as procedure and oversight as flexibility. The system didn't survive on corruption in the usual sense. It survived on legitimacy, and that legitimacy had been granted again and again without friction. As night fell, the numbers stopped being approximated. More than 4 tons of narcotics recovered from vehicles, warehouses, and underground distribution points linked by the same routing logic. $120 million seized or frozen mid-flow. Dozens detained across jurisdictions. Not street-level figures, but administrators, coordinators, managers, people whose names never made headlines but whose signatures appeared everywhere else. Care facilities filled quietly. No announcements, no cameras. Victims were relocated without fanfare. Many couldn't identify the city they were in. Some didn't know how long they had been gone. Medical staff logged recovery patterns that mirrored what analysts had seen in the data. Feeding schedules, transport readiness, chemical dependence cycles. Healing itself required undoing logistics. The following morning, the city appeared unchanged. Buildings stood, streets were plowed, offices opened on schedule, but the unseen machinery beneath the surface was gone. Municipal garages sat unused. Warehouses were sealed with printed notices taped to glass. Phone lines that had always been answered led nowhere. Emergency hearings were convened before internal reports were finalized. Officials leaned on familiar phrases: process failures, oversight gaps, coordination breakdowns. Behind closed doors, the conclusion was far less forgiving. This hadn't been accidental. It had been designed trust. Financial investigators abandoned projections. The totals no longer fit on slides. Public funds had flowed through vendors that delivered exactly what their invoices promised, just not what anyone thought they were paying for. That was the innovation, not cleaning dirty money, but transforming credibility into propulsion. Within days, priorities shifted quietly. New units formed, not focused solely on drugs or trafficking, but on camouflage. Workforce initiatives, non-profits, municipal contractors, institutions built on assumption rather than inspection. The lesson was unavoidable. The strongest cover isn't secrecy, it's reputation. The individual in custody never addressed the public. Most of the others questioned didn't either. Their silence wasn't resistance, it was routine. They had spent careers operating inside frameworks, not outside them. In their minds, they hadn't broken anything, they had optimized it. One question, however, kept resurfacing in internal briefings. Why now? There had been no whistleblower, no careless transfer, no last-minute scramble. What exposed the system wasn't greed or brutality, it was expansion. One authorization too many, one replication too far, one pattern repeated often enough to be noticed. The system had grown beyond its ability to remain invisible. Weeks later, analysts continued pulling threads. Beneath route diagrams and financial ledgers were notes that didn't resolve, design observations written in a voice that matched no one in custody, commentary on how trust is manufactured, how reputations shield activity, how oversight can be redirected without confrontation. The architect was never identified, only inferred. Someone who understood not just crime, but institutions. Someone who didn't need to move drugs or money. Someone who built environments where others did it automatically. The operation concluded. The tunnels were sealed. The $120 million channel was cut. The drugs were removed from circulation. But the final conclusion, buried deep inside an internal assessment, was colder than any public statement. This wasn't a cartel issue. It wasn't a law enforcement failure. It was an architectural vulnerability. Because when a system can be turned into a weapon simply by obeying its own rules, the greatest danger isn't those who exploit it. It's how long everyone else assumes it never will.